Hi everyone. We might just get this show on the road, or shall I say, get it on the superhighway maybe. For those that don't know me, I'm Dot West, a Noongar woman from the southwest of Western Australia and chair of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. I welcome you all to the launch of the first Mapping the Digital Gap annual report for 2023. Today, the research team from the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society and industry partner Telstra will outline the findings from the first round of research conducted in 10 remote communities across Australia in 2022. I actually come to you from beautiful Yawuru country here in Broome, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways on which we all gather today, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today and offer a warm welcome to you all. The First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group was established by the Australian Government earlier this year. All members are First Nations Australians, and we are supported by a digital inclusion expert panel. This includes Associate Professor Linda Norman Parker, who's Deputy Chair of the Advisory Group, and Dr. Daniel Featherstone and Lauren Ganley on the expert panel. The Advisory Group's purpose is to provide advice on Target 17 of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, which aims for equal levels of digital inclusion by 2026. The target came about during my time as First Nations Media Australia Chair, whilst I was working with the Coalition of Peaks and building on proposals from Broadband for the Bush Indigenous Focus Day 2017. Can I tell you that it was a real challenge trying to get this target included in the Closing the Gap framework? Because whilst we all knew there was a big digital divide, there was no data to support our claims, and government pushed back on a number of times. But thankfully, the Coalition of Peaks supported Target 17 and were able to advocate for its inclusion. In a bigger picture, Target 17 aims to achieve Outcome 17, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have access to information and services, enabling participation in informed decision-making regarding their own lives. Digital inclusion is a human right, as highlighted by the United Nations Secretary-General report, which said, connectivity is no longer a luxury, but a lifeline to working, learning, keeping in touch, and accessing essential services. I think today's Zoom is testament to that. However, here in Australia, there are many that either have no connection or at best a limited service. Measuring digital inclusion across Australia allows us to highlight those who remain unseen and unheard. It ensures we provide for those who need the most help and that they are not ignored. Data also highlights where we have achieved success. It tells a story over time where we can look proudly on how First Nations communities, government and industry, through genuine collaboration and innovation, have led to meaningful and positive changes. Although remote First Nations communities are among the most economically and digitally disadvantaged in Australia, they are also sites of extraordinary innovation, cultural and social resilience, and technical adaptation. The Mapping the Digital Gap project is a crucial piece of work because it considers the individual lived experiences of a community. Just as Australia's environment and geography is diverse, so too are First Nations communities, which means that technologies and products for one community may not be applicable for others. This is why community engagement and talking to people directly is absolutely critical. The data provided by the Mapping the Digital Gap project empowers First Nations communities by assisting their own decision-making and strengthening their advocacy and development. This empowerment changes the way we see connectivity from a problem to be solved to connectivity as a way to support First Nations communities achieve their aspirations. Whether that be sharing their culture and arts, improving health outcomes, more education and employment opportunities, or simply to connect with friends and family. This research addresses a lack of data to understand the scale and nature of the digital gap for First Nations people and tracks progress towards Target 17 of the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap. Today, we will hear opening pre-recorded remarks by Minister for Communications, Honourable Michelle Rowland MP. We will then hear from Lauren Ganley, up there sitting in the Northern Territory, the Head of First Nations Strategy and Engagement with Industry Partner Telstra, and ARC, Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society Director and Australian Digital Inclusion Index Leader, Researcher, Distinguished Professor Julian Thomas. This will be followed by an outline of findings by First Nations researcher, Associate Professor Linda Norman Parker, and Dr. Daniel Featherstone, accompanied by a short film by our co-researchers in Wilcannia. There'll be a 20 to 25 minute time for questions with Julian, Lauren, Lyndon and Daniel. You'll be able to scan the Slido link on your mobile or use the link and number on your computer to enter your questions in Slido. You can also like a question that is already listed to raise it up, so to elevate it, and we'll ask the questions with the most likes first. But with the digital divide, we can be thankful that there has been strong engagement by the Australian Government through Minister Rowlands on digital inclusion issues, including the establishment of the advisory group. The advisory group has recently provided its initial report to the Australian Government, identifying barriers and recommendations regarding the digital divide. We hope to publish this report shortly. But this report broadly covers the need for more data, delivery of targeted measures for access and affordability of services, First Nations-led programs to improve digital ability. So this is now a great opportunity to now present the pre-recorded message by Honourable Michelle Rowlands MP, Minister for Communications.
Hi, I'm Michelle Rowland, the Minister for Communications. Thank you for inviting me to make some remarks at the launch of the inaugural Mapping the Digital Gap Outcomes report. I acknowledge the traditional owners of country, including the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the land that I am on today, and throughout Australia I pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend this to First Nations people taking part in today's launch, and all the communities involved in this important research project. Our government is committed to bridging the digital divide for all First Nations Australians by 2026, Target 17 of Closing the Gap. To achieve this, we need a policy approach in true partnership with First Nations communities, underpinned by a strong evidence base. This is why the Mapping the Digital Gap research project is so important. From Gallowinku to Wilcannia, researchers engaged 12 First Nations communities to better understand what digital inclusion looks like on the ground. Complementing the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, this research highlights barriers and opportunities for digital inclusion in different communities. It also shows us the diversity across communities, underscoring the importance of place-based approaches. Earlier this year, along with Minister Linda Burney, I released the First Nations Digital Inclusion Plan, which centres around 3 pillars of access, affordability and ability. The plan commits us to ongoing dialogue and collaboration with First Nations communities to achieve Target 17 of Closing the Gap. I acknowledge the work of First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group members, which is chaired by Dot West. Ms West is joined by a number of people who are here today. Associate Professor Lyndon Orman-Parker, who is Deputy Chair, and Ms Lauren Ganley and Dr Daniel Featherston, who sit on the advisory group's Digital Inclusion Expert Panel. I thank all of them for the contribution they have made to the advisory group's work over the past 8 months. The advisory group's initial report to government includes practical recommendations to improve digital inclusion, data collection, and community engagement. Digital inclusion is not a privilege, it's a necessity. It enables participation, social connection, access to services, information, entertainment, and opportunities. I commend the inaugural Mapping the Digital Gap report and look forward to future outcomes of this project as we move to bridge the digital divide.
Thank you, Minister Rowlands, for that pre-record. So moving right along, our next speaker is Lauren Ganley, Head of Telstra's First Nations Strategy and Engagement with First Nations peoples and communities. She's been an advocate of digital inclusion equity for remote communities for decades, working within Telstra and through external partnerships and other collaborative efforts. Lauren sits on several boards of organisations that focus on supporting the aspirations of First Nations people. Lauren is a graduate and fellow of the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Dot. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Many of you will know that Telstra has funded the Australian Digital Inclusion Index since 2015. And in July this year, we launched the 8th annual report. But what's been missing from these reports is the remote data. So we're absolutely right to be funding RMIT to be doing this important research, and which is an extension of the ADII. So what's important about the research is that it's a recognised benchmark for assessing progress on digital inclusion and provides us the essential data to inform effective programs and policies. I personally have been on the journey for a while. Back in 2013, I did some research on behalf of Telstra to understand the digital divide for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and what that gave us was the evidence to support research, to support funding programs to help to bridge that divide. And back then, I worked with Daniel Featherstone to develop the IndigiMod program, which pleasingly is still going 10 years on. But you know, it's the research and the evidence that committed and made sense to Telstra to fund it. So the importance of industry and research partnerships is absolutely vital. You know, you'd need the evidence to inform the programs and the policy, and then to track the progress. What has been absolutely wonderful about this research, Mapping the Gap research, is the approach, and you know, the way that Daniel and Lyndon and the team have gone about it, engaging with local researchers in communities, has just been absolutely remarkable and fundamental to really listening to those stories firsthand and getting to the heart of people's lived experience. And this is what needs to be done to make sure that people are part of the digital world in what, you know, we're on the precipice of a technology revolution. So it's absolutely vital that people can participate in this digital world. And I want to sincerely thank Dot, Lyndon and Daniel and others who really lobbied and pushed hard for closing the gap target 17, of which, you know, I'm really proud to be an expert panel member, and with a looming target of 2026, which is not that far away, there is plenty to do. So this is really important research that we're absolutely proud to be a part of, and we're committed to continuing to fund this research beyond this round, because, you know, as I said earlier, we need the benchmark, we need the evidence, we need to have programs and policies that work, and we need to be able to measure that. So yeah, I look forward to continuing to work with the team to continue doing the research in remote Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Our next speaker is Distinguished Professor Julian Thomas, who's the Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, and a Distinguished Professor in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University. Julian has led the Australian Digital Inclusion Index research from its inception since 2015. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you, Dot, and it's really exciting and to be part of the launch for this report today. I wanted to provide just some context before we get to the key findings for why we did this research and where it fits in the larger project around digital inclusion and the closing the gap targets. So just to say something very briefly, as Lauren said, the Mapping the Digital Gap project has grown out of our work on the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which we have been doing with Telstra and more recently as part of our ARC Centre, ADM+S, for some years now. Now, the point of the Digital Inclusion Index was, and I think Lauren's actually said this already, was to provide an evidence base that we needed for policies and programs to address what we could see were the significant challenges for digital inclusion in Australia. So what the index does is provide a measure that shows us the distribution of digital inclusion across Australia, both over time, so we can see how this is changing as infrastructure and services improve, and also across the very varied social and physical and cultural geography of Australia. So we could see the differences between the regional areas and the big cities. There were some gaps, of course, in the data that we could generate out of the surveys that we use to generate the Digital Inclusion Index. I'll come to that, but that is a big part of the reason for the current work. So what we do in the index is to provide that baseline measure of digital inclusion. We use survey data that enables us to track digital inclusion across what we call 3 different dimensions, across access, affordability, and digital ability. And as you know from what we've already said about the First Nations Digital Inclusion Action Plan and all the work that has been done in this area, those 3 different dimensions are all critically important for the problems we're addressing today. So that's the work that the index does. It approaches digital inclusion as necessarily a complex problem which requires action and programs at multiple levels. It's been a collaboration from the beginning across universities with our colleagues at Swinburne University, as well as here at RMIT and elsewhere in our centre, in our ARC Centre of Excellence, ADM+S, but also very much with our colleagues at Telstra. Now, as I said, our approach of mapping digital inclusion on the basis of a national survey has always meant that we have not had the detailed data required to properly understand the distribution of digital inclusion across First Nations communities, and especially in remote Australia, where research, of course, is a complex challenge. Now we need more so than ever, we critically need an understanding of precisely those issues because of the Closing the Gap target 17 and the outcome 17 for closing the gap that Dot and Lauren have been talking about. If we are to make genuine progress to closing the gap in those areas, we need a robust measure and a robust evidence base to understand where we are and what needs to be done. So that's why we have developed this project in addition and building on the work of the Digital Inclusion Index. We recognise, and you'll hear more about this as we talk further about it, but we understand that this kind of work needs to be done in quite a different way from a national survey. It involves working with particular First Nations communities, their organisations and their leaders, and that's what we've done. So just one further point. Thanks. About the Mapping the Digital Gap project, established, as I said, to provide the remote First Nations data to support the index. We've worked with 12 remote communities to generate First Nations index scores, which are comparable with our Digital Inclusion Index scores, and enable us to track changes over time in those communities. This gives us, we think, a reliable baseline to measure progress towards target 17. So we have been collecting that data, working with those communities, and we're now in a position to put it together and provide some indication of where we think we're up to. On our Digital Inclusion Index website, you can find a lot of this information which you can dig into for yourself. So there's a QR code on your screen there, which will take you to our dashboard, which enables you to dig into this data. It enables you to look at the data that we have on the digital gap for First Nations people according to remoteness and according to those 3 different dimensions of digital inclusion, together with the results of our work with the research sites for mapping the digital gap. So you can explore it there for yourself. I'll just say a little bit about what it tells us overall. You can see that there's just moving along to that there is the key finding is that there is a significant gap between digital inclusion levels for First Nations peoples and for non-First Nations peoples in Australia. It's a gap of 7.5 points. In our scale, where we have a national average level of digital inclusion for the Australian population as a whole of around 70 points, that is a substantial gap. And it's one that will take concerted effort, as the expert group and the advisory group have clearly identified to bridge. If we perhaps look at just one little snapshot into the data, it does show you that the gap varies dramatically across Australia. If we look at it in terms of how remote people are, we find that the gap is particularly pronounced for First Nations people who are living in remote and very remote communities. So the gap for those communities is of the order of 24, 25 points, not 7.5 points. So it is very substantial. Access is a critical issue, but as the data in that dashboard will show you, it is not the only issue. These are complex problems. So we're really proud to be launching the report today. It's the result of a huge amount of work from a large team. I'll introduce those people to you in a minute and say something about what they've done. It's the result of a very productive collaboration with our colleagues in Telstra and our partner investigator in this project, Lauren Ganley. And it's also, I think, been spurred on and stimulated further by the interest of the government in seriously addressing these gaps. There's a lot more to the project beyond those very high-level findings, and I think they will show the unique challenges of digital inclusion in remote communities. The report deals with the key survey results, the indicators of the gap in the communities we've looked at, the context and the findings of the research sites that we've examined, the analysis of the results across those 3 different dimensions: access, affordability, and ability in each of those places, and data which helps us understand the crucial role of digital service delivery and of news and media services in those communities. So there are case studies, there are photos, there are quotes from the people that we've talked to, all highlighting the on-the-ground experience for people who live in those communities, the service providers who work there across the sites that we've used. So that's the report. As I say, jump in and have a look. Let me just say something about the team that has produced this, because it is an amazing group of people, and I've been very lucky to work with them and have learned a huge amount from all of them. So big thank yous, of course, to our Telstra colleagues and Lauren in particular, to the First Nations Expert Advisory Group, to the research team, Daniel, Lyndon, Indigo, and Jenny, Sharon, working at Swinburne University, our colleagues in the Centre for Social Research at ANU, Leah, who has done a great deal of the work on the communications side, the engagement side. She has designed this beautiful looking outcomes report. Kieran, who has contributed enormously to the writing and analysis of the material in the report, and to Lucy for all of her work in coordinating the project and editing it, and all our colleagues in our ADM+S Centre who have done so much on the operational and administrative side to make this possible. So, Dot, thank you. I hope that gives you a quick insight into what this report does.
Thanks, Julian. Before I introduce the next speaker, I'd just like to acknowledge 2 members of our expert panel that are online joining us today, and that's Shay Cockatoo Collins and Neil Turner. So thanks for joining, guys. So our next speaker is Associate Professor Linda Norman Parker, an Aboriginal man of Alawa descent from the Barkly Table region of the Northern Territory. He's the Principal Research Fellow with the Mapping the Digital Gap project. He's also an Australian Research Council Research Fellow with the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at ANU. Lyndon is also Deputy Chair of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. So basically, he's my right-hand man, Lyndon. So take it away, Lyndon.
Thanks, Dot. Thanks, Chair Dot. Appreciate the shout out. And look, I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong and Wanurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, from where we're joining you today. And we'll just go to the next slide. This is a slide of our research sites right across Australia. And these 10 sites were selected for diversity in geography, context, size, remoteness, media and communication services available, and where communities that were interested in participating in the research project. The project methodology followed a well-recognised guidelines for ethical research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, including the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research, ethical guidelines, and the National Health and Medical Research Council guidelines. With input from the Mapping the Digital Gap First Nations Advisory Group. And when the project was first started, RMIT established a reference group, which I would like to shout out to Scott Winch, Romaine Morton, Lauren Ganley, Heron Loban, and Yingana Mark Gayola, MP from the Northern Territory. So thank you to those that were instrumental in establishing the research methodologies. So the method for data collection, including collecting and adapted quantitative ADII survey, complemented by qualitative research interviews with community members and local service providers. The research followed the key principles of respect, relevance, community benefit, and local community collaboration with our partner organisations. So as you can see here, these are our partner organisation. And so it was important that we partnered with Aboriginal community-based organisations, and our collaboration included partnering with First Nations organisations and working with community co-researchers to conduct the qualitative research, including the annual in-person surveys. This partnership approach has been key to successful community engagement across all sites. The partnership model, working with First Nations organisations and community co-researchers in each site, ensured that the essential participation at the local level. Our community-based researchers also acted as interpreters, where English was a second or third language in the community, to help interpret the surveys and help understand the research that we were conducting. So I'd like to thank all 10 research partner organisations in 2022, and along with the 21 co-researchers in 2022 as well. So thank you. So I'll just briefly talk about the research findings for 2022 research. So here we have 10 communities were visited. The survey, 10 communities that were visited, 21 community researchers, 530 surveys were conducted, of which 495 were First Nations, and 140 interviews across all 10 sites. We provided all research findings back to each community as individual community outcome reports, of which many of you would have read online already. And as part of our commitment to share data back with the community, which also supported what we call Indigenous data sovereignty. And our research reports also assist the community to develop local digital inclusion plans. And local Indigenous inclusion plans assist the community in working out and identifying local solutions to individual digital inclusion issues in each location. So thanks. I'll just do a quick summary. So this is the First Nations digital gap. So building on the overall digital inclusion scores that Julian has highlighted, I will briefly outline below. The gap varies across the different dimensions, including access, affordability, and digital ability. The results can be found on the First Nations dashboard, and we showed a QR code for that earlier on. So the biggest disparity, as you can see, is for remote First Nations people in access, with a huge gap in remoteness of 37 points and very remote 38 points. So as you can see, there's a sliding scale here that as you go further out in terms of access, the gap widens. We'll talk about affordability, snapshot next. So there are significant affordability barriers faced by First Nations people, particularly in remote communities. Affordability barriers exist due to low incomes and relatively high cost of prepaid mobile and mobile data. And mobile phones, as Daniel will talk about later, is the prepaid mobile phones is the major way that Indigenous people in remote communities access the internet. However, ADII affordability scores are based on the cost of a good quality internet bundle relative to household income. So what this doesn't provide for is the full story of remote First Nations communities due to the difficulty of quantifying income and expenditure for extremely large homes and overcrowding in households. In some instances, we had up to 14 to 16 people living in the one household. Therefore, the income, it assumed that the household had a large overall income. This is also due, this is largely due to the high reliance on prepaid mobile as a primary means of phone and internet access. Our report will provide more detail on the affordability issue, drawing on other data collected in our survey. So when we talk about digital ability, while First Nations people are rapid adopters of digital technology, and applications. However, digital ability gap of 4.3 points at the national level increases significantly for remote and very remote First Nations people. We also see that in some instances, the First Nations digital ability was actually quite high in major cities and above the national average. So we'll go on to First Nations digital inclusion and exclusion. So the ADII assigns 4 key thresholds for understanding how people experience digital inclusion or exclusion. Highly excluded, a score of under 45, excluded above 45 and below 61, included above 61 and below 80, and highly included 80 or above. People who are highly excluded lack the digital resources required to participate fully in the economic, social, and civic life, compounding barriers to education, work, and vital services. Among participants in the 10 research sites visited in 2022, 45% were highly excluded compared to the national average of 9%, and 4.1% of remote First Nations participants are highly included, compared to 46% of the overall general Australian population. This is a clear evidence of the need for targeted efforts to close the digital gap in remote Australia. I'll now hand back to Dot. Thank you, Dot.
Might help if I take myself off mute, eh? All right, so thanks, Lyndon, thanks for that. Now we'd like you to sit back and enjoy a short video with the Wilcannia co-researchers.
Welcome to Wilcannia where the dollar flies. Stars in the black, but the cotton farmers keep the bark alive. Barkers United, 10,000 generations. Being people of the river since the dawn of creation. Take it for a stroll from the Mallee to the mission back to town. Warriors and boomerangs play to shake the ground. Whimpitches, barking Jim proud. Whimpitches, barking Jim proud.
Communication is one of the most important resources we need. It's really essential that we need to voice to Australia, the issues that we face on a daily basis. It impacts on our education, it impacts on our employment, it impacts on our everyday life through social and emotional well-being. So during the pandemic, it was really highlighted in that, especially around our young people that had to stay home from school. So every day missing out on school meant every day they were losing that quality education they deserve.
Another big problem exposed by the town's COVID crisis was the terrible internet access.
And how do you make and receive phone calls?
A team of researchers has been working with the community to map the digital gap and come up with some local solutions over the next 4 years.
During COVID, it was obviously a really big issue for a lot of our communities where people weren't able to work from home or do homeschooling or access services that were closed down during lockdown periods. And so a lot of people in remote communities were left out completely from having access to what many of the people in mainstream urban and regional areas were able to do.
So how many people in your house have a mobile phone?
In 2026, digital inclusion is supposed to be part of closing the gap. And this is our evidence that we need to show to the government that we should get the exactly same type of service we need for Wilcannia that you get in Dubbo, that you get in Sydney and Melbourne and all those areas. So right now we're working really hard to get that evidence together.
So my name is Anthony Wiltshire. I'm Shaylin's husband. I'm originally, Horse Creek is my hometown in WA in the Kimberleys. My ethnic background is from the Torres Straits, Arab Island, and also Fijian as well. So yeah, that's me.
And my name is Shaylin Wyman. I'm a Barkindji woman from Wilcannia, born and raised here.
So we've been co-researchers for the RMIT University. So there was a team that came from Victoria that came here just to get an overview of what the internet service and that is like. So our job was to do a survey and interview the community and see what their response was. Yeah.
I was really nervous at first, yeah. But then after a while I sort of got used to doing the surveys and yeah, it was kind of easy then.
What personal achievements did you get from that?
Learning how to do interviews with people in the community and to do surveys as well. Yeah, so, yep.
Why do you think you feel that this could be a good type of work you could get into?
I guess just interacting with different people and community members and yeah, all the organisations and yeah, it's really good.
For me, it's been like one voice, but now, you know, with the remarkable work with our local co-researchers and of course your team, we got to hear over 100 voices in a few days, and that is that's remarkable, and I'm very proud that I was part of that partnership.
Okay, a great little video from Wilcannia Mob. So our final speaker for today is Dr. Daniel Featherstone, a Senior Research Fellow at RMIT University and part of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. He is lead researcher on the Mapping the Digital Gap project. Take it away, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Dot. And yeah, I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement of the Boon Wurrung and Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and of course to the traditional owners of all of the lands from which people are joining today. So, and also a big shout out to the fantastic leadership that we've had in this project, and with Lyndon and Lauren and our expert advisory group providing that initial guidance, and of course to Dot and the First Nation Digital Inclusion Advisory Group that are now taking this to the next level and informing those programs and policies going forward. So it's a real honour to be working with people like that and to be able to share the findings that we have been able to get through this research to really inform those discussions. I'd also really like to echo what Lyndon has talked about with the importance of our collaborators. And you've seen it just there with that video about how important it is for us to work with those community partners and with the co-researchers on the ground to get the trust and the engagement with the community to really share their stories and experiences, and to participate in this research. It's no mean feat to get 530 surveys in 10 sites. So that's been absolutely because of that engagement through those co-researchers. So that's again been a really great outcome from this work. What I'm going to cover now is some of the more detailed findings. So settle in. We'll go through some of the analysis that we've done, both from the survey findings, but also from the observations and the interviews that we've done with people. So I'll go through that first of all to show the overall digital inclusion levels across our sites, and then across each of those dimensions that Julian referred to earlier. So this map is a great visual representation of the levels of digital inclusion scores that have been averaged across each of the communities that we worked in. You can see there, there's quite a wide variation in the scores. So Ereb right up the top in the Torres Strait, a score of 60.2, and Wilcannia, where we've just heard from the team down in Western New South Wales, have relatively high scores compared with many of the other smaller communities and ones that have other challenges around either access or affordability or digital ability. And so that's what we've really wanted to see in selecting all of these sites, why there's such a variation, and start to drill down on where that comes through to people's experience and where those targeted measures need to go next to try and address those. So we'll skip to talking about some of the access issues that we've identified. As Lyndon referred to earlier, prepaid mobile is the primary means of phone and internet access across almost all of the communities that we've visited. It's a fairly consistent finding, with 84% of people either owning or sharing a mobile phone, and 94% of those being prepaid. So very low uptake of postpaid services. We're also seeing that in fixed services on households. There's about 13% of households of the people that we surveyed had NBN Sky Muster, which is the only NBN service available in most remote communities in Australia. And about 1% had ADSL services. So they're very, very low take up of postpaid services generally. And that's because of unreliable incomes, very low incomes, and also because of large shared households that data use tends to be hard to manage across those fixed services. What we did see is that in like Sky Muster and fixed line services, there's high uptake, of course, by the agencies and by staff houses in communities, and that's where the primary access is. And of course, that's also becomes the means of access for many of the community members when they do need fixed services where there's no mobile coverage in communities. And when we talk about no mobile coverage, there's about 670 small communities and homelands that still don't have any mobile coverage out of about 1,545 overall First Nation communities. While we know that there's been a big rollout of mobile over the last 10 years or so through the Mobile Black Spots program, regional connectivity programs, there's still a lot of smaller communities where we've really reached the end of that, where there's a market model that will work to roll out more of those services. So we really need to move into another type of model to get more coverage. In 8 of the 10 sites that we visited, there was 4G coverage. So Yuulamu and Gangan homeland in East Arnhem Land didn't have any 4G. Yuulamu, it has since been installed, but that's where services like Wi-Fi become a big part of the delivery, that people can use Wi-Fi to access internet, and often that's publicly available. But we know that that's also has challenges in that it's often usually around a small hotspot. So that we've got a case study that looks at Wi-Fi and also Wi-Fi mesh networks in communities such as in Columbaroo that we visited. There's also a limited home access to computers. Most people are using internet only on their mobile, so that's can impact on the types of applications that people use and where they can access services. So some communities do have internet access facilities, but for the most part, we found that was missing in communities. I'll skip over to the next slide, which is showing how this looks in terms of our survey data across each of the communities. So while there's a national score of 72.1 for access, the average across our sites was well below half of that, 33.9. And so that gap is enormous in remote communities in access. And really that's the biggest gap across the index. But this graph shows how that varies significantly between communities, particularly those very small communities without mobile, such as Gangan. But we do know that access is more than just having internet access. It's also about access to devices. It's also about actually using internet. And so having those internet access facilities in communities is a part of that mix, but also making sure that people have Wi-Fi if there isn't other ways of accessing. I'll jump over to affordability, and we'll, while Lyndon has explained some of the challenges with the way affordability is measured and the way that we can explain it with the data, we do have a lot of both on the ground evidence and other questions that we've collected through our surveys that really show that data affordability is a significant issue for people in communities. For example, we found that 35.9% of participants sometimes had to sacrifice or cut back on essential household costs such as food or bills to stay connected, with a further 15.2% saying they were often or always having to cut back. Nearly half of participants compromised on the speed of, or data allowances of their internet connections in order to be able to afford them. And 51% of remote residents pay more than 5% of their monthly household income for communications, compared with 27% for other Australians. So we do see that affordability is a significant issue. One of the challenges is that as the shift to online government services and other services, people are increasingly having to use the internet to be able to do day-to-day activities. And that's now shifting to a user pays model where people are having to use their own credit to be able to access what should be effectively free services, and that many other Australians take for granted as being available. Cost of devices, sorry, we'll just skip back. Cost of devices is an issue, and particularly with what we see in communities is that there's a high turnover of devices as well, with sharing of devices, a fairly big part of the sort of cultural use within remote communities. There's a limited shift from prepaid to postpaid services, and I think that needs to be addressed in the types of products that are available. We'll have a look at that graph now, and while we can see that the average affordability score for the sites that we visited was 89.1, it's 6 points below the non-First Nations national average score. That's actually, we've sort of widened the gap here, widened the graph to show the starting point at 75. It actually is a significant difference in terms of affordability, as I've described with those other survey results. With 51% of people paying more than 5% of their monthly household, the benchmark is around 2% of what people should be paying for communications. So it does mean that there's a much higher rate because of the expense of prepaid data, which tends to be around $3 to $4 per gigabyte. Most other Australians are paying well under $1. We'll skip over to digital ability. As Lyndon described, we know that there's a rapid uptake of digital technologies where they're available. People are very good at getting online, connecting with families, using banking and other services, and also using, all the social media and YouTube and other entertainment forms. And so digital ability is often more affected by people's access and affordability issues than by their ability to engage with the technologies. But there are some definite gaps, and we see those particularly for elderly people. The scores for people in the 65 to 74 year age range of 16.7 vary compared with 61.3 for 18 to 34s. So there's, you know, a 40-point gap, 45-point gap there. The people living with a disability, there's a gap of 16.6 compared to people living without a disability. Those who speak language other than English at home, there's a 17.1 gap between those who speak a language at home and those who only speak English. And so there's fairly significant gaps that we're seeing by those demographic elements. And one of the ones that surprised us was that there's quite a big gender gap. In fact, males have an average score of 6.7 below females in the communities that we visited, which is almost the opposite of some of the national trends. Social media is a big part of the way that people engage and use digital technologies, particularly to keep in touch with family and friends and to share news and information. And of course, it also brings with it some misinformation. And so what we have seen is that particularly during COVID and some of the stories that Brendan referred to in that video, there was a lot of misinformation being spread through social media. And I'll come to that in a minute when we talk about access to other news and media sources, because sometimes there aren't other reliable sources of information available within households. Cyber safety is a significant concern, and particularly as scams are becoming more prevalent, there are some that are really being targeted to people in remote communities. In fact, I saw one just yesterday come through that's being specifically targeted into small communities, and it's people need that local support and awareness to make sure that they can understand the difference of, you know, what is reliable information, what is a scam. And so that need for localized and appropriate training and support, and we've talked about in the report, we've got a case study looking at the potential of having local digital mentors to provide that support and awareness at a community level, and build that capacity within the community. We'll jump over to the graph, and again, you can see that digital ability is quite a big part of the gap here. There's a 19.2 point difference between the national averages and the averages across the sites that we visited, but that varies really significantly across the communities that we went to. So Ereb in the Torres Strait is actually ahead of the national average score. People are very digitally savvy, even though there's limited access in parts of the island. There's a high uptake and usage of digital technology. Similarly in Wilcannia, but then we drop down to those sites, particularly Gangan, that has very limited access. And surprisingly, even some of the bigger sites like Wadair and Galawinku, that where there is access but low engagement, and that we've sort of drilled down on that within the report to understand what some of those other factors might be around language speaking, age, the services that are available within the community, and whether people just prefer to have face-to-face services rather than using online services. So there's quite a bit of that interpretation we've been able to put into the report. I'll jump over to news and media. So what we have seen with news and media, First Nations radio and TV are primary services in community. People trust these as reliable sources of news and information. They're often delivered in language, and they provide a localized and targeted stories and local voices as well. So some of our communities have RIBS, or remote Indigenous broadcasting services, with broadcasters like Walter Louis up here, who is and they provide that targeted information. However, some of those sites weren't active when we visited, and yet the First Nation regional radio services were still the most listened to radio services in all sites. Very few people have radios at home. They're mostly listening in the car. Some people are starting to listen on their phones through apps as well. YouTube is often used as a primary form of entertainment. And one of the reasons we found out is because TV services aren't working in most of these communities. In fact, the vast delivery of TV that was rolled out about 10 years ago has broken down in many of these sites, where about 50% of households no longer have a TV working, so direct-to-home TV services. And that increases up to 80 to 90% in some communities. And in Gangan homeland, 100% of the houses had no TV working. So that has a real impact on how people are accessing reliable and trusted news and information sources. And again, that misinformation can be an impact. Another impact is that people are paying their own prepaid data to access their entertainment, whereas other Australians are getting free access to those news and information services. So I'll keep on going. I realise we're running short on time, but I'll jump over to, we do have a bit of a case study about that vast TV issue within the report as well. The last section is around service delivery. And we talked to a lot of the service providers in communities, within the health clinics, the schools, the local shire or council, police and other services across each community, to really get an understanding of how they used communications and to give that bigger sort of community-wide communications ecology, and to really see, because people rely on those services on a day-to-day basis, it's critical that they have reliable services. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. And so while people, generally rely on online services for cloud-based delivery of their databases and Zoom meetings and recording, and a lot of like telehealth and other services, particularly in the top end where there's cloud cover for up to 6 months of the year during the wet season. Satellite services can be less reliable during those periods, and the latency issues and congestion had a real impact in some of those service provision sites. Some people saying they had to go back to doing handwritten records at times when there were outages, particularly. One of the findings that's come out of that is that during emergencies, there needs to be those backup services. So a redundancy model to ensure that there is continuation of access to online delivery during those, when there are either cloud cover or outages within the community. And so increasingly, there has been a take up of a type of satellite or another type of service to ensure that redundancy. I'll jump over to the last part, which is next steps. And so what this year, we've done another round of surveys and interviews in 11 communities. We added Warrakurna community to the 10 that we went to last year. Hopefully we'll have one more next year. We've got our community outcomes reports that we'll be updating to give what's changed since we went there the first year. We also have a Mapping the Digital Gap website coming, so that will be launched in the next couple of months, hopefully. Just got some final tweaks to do on that, and that'll provide all of this data and the information for each of the sites and some other resources. We'll be working with each of the communities on their local digital inclusion plans, and of course, preparing for our next round of research next year, which will be the last round for this iteration of Mapping the Digital Gap. But as Lauren pointed out, Telstra have said that they will continue to fund the project. So we're looking forward to working on the details of how that looks and potentially looking at other case study sites beyond the ones that we're visiting now. We will have a final project report in 25 to summarise what we've seen over the 3 rounds of this first part of the project. So stay tuned, and we look forward to keeping you up to date with how we see progress on closing the gaps target 17 over the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So now it's time for Q&A. I hope you've already scanned the Slido link on your mobile, or you've used the link and number on your computer so you can enter your question in Slido. You can like a question that is already listed to raise its ranking up, and we'll ask the questions with the most likes first. So we've got, about 20, 25 minutes to get the questions happening. But first, it's my turn to ask some questions. So while you get your questions ready, firstly, I'd just like to ask Julian, given the scale of the digital inclusion gap identified in this research, what do you see as necessary for meaningful progress towards closing the gap by 2026?
Thanks, Dot. And I think what we've seen is the scale of the problem and the complexity of the challenge. The fact that we've got to address all those dimensions of digital inclusion in order to make substantive progress towards closing the gap. I think we can sort of see that, we can see the dimensions of the problem pretty clearly coming out of the work we've done. And I think the First Nations Digital Inclusion Group has done a great deal of the work in thinking about how we go about this, because while we need to progress actions in relation to all of those different areas, access, ability and affordability, they're all different problems but interrelated ones. There are specific things that need to be done with each of those, and I think Daniel and Lyndon's discussion of where the issues arise give us a really good sense of what we need to do. But that emphasis in the First Nations Digital Inclusion Group's report on a strategic framework for approaching this, where we combine a coordinated approach with the local and community-driven solutions, really is the most coherent approach we've seen so far to addressing these issues. So I think there's a great deal of hope in that broad approach, with lots of specific actions that do need to be worked out at a local level, Dot, in order to address the big gap.
Okay, thanks. Lyndon, a question from our audience. How did you choose the 10 to 12 remote communities to work with and engage on the data?
Well, the remote communities were chosen based on different regions, but also the different size and complexity of the regional remote communities. They were also chosen on around which communities, several were approached, which communities had the capacity and wanted to engage in the project. So it was really done as a negotiated process. We also pay the community-based organisations in which we partner, and who in turn pay for the community-based researchers as well. So there was a very selection process. We have had other people since we started the project potentially suggest that they would like to be involved further down the track. So yeah, it was a negotiation.
And Lauren, how's Telstra supporting remote communities to get and stay connected?
Yeah, so we're working on the co-investment opportunities through the Regional Connectivity Program, but also looking for other opportunities with other stakeholders to get more coverage, more mobile coverage into remote areas. We I mean, what's been really great about working on the advisory group expert panel is looking at more collaborative efforts within the telco industry, you know, with other partners and with governments. So that's been a really wonderful opportunity that the Ministers' Advisory Group has brought together, is bringing together those industry people. So that's been good. What's been great as well is understanding other barriers to connectivity around electricity. So, you know, that's been a big one that, you know, I'm sort of trying to do a deeper dive into. But also, you know, we recognise through the research that, generally speaking, people in remote communities use the mobile device for everything. And so if we can address, you know, some of the issues that Daniel mentioned around television, you know, where people can use other means to access, you know, watching TV or, you know, streaming services, then that will help to take some pressure off the mobile network. But we are doing at Telstra a detailed analysis of all of the remote communities to have a look at what the existing infrastructure looks like, you know, for as much as we can see through desktop research, to, you know, plan a more coordinated approach to how we get everyone connected. And then, of course, you know, we know that satellite is going to be a solution that's coming, but you know, that's a few months off. Thanks, Todd.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Now, Daniel, Dr. PJ Holtham is curious to learn the next phase of the project. Is there an intention to bring in government agencies such as Centrelink, NIAA, to help address the issues that's been identified in this report?
Yeah, thanks to PJ. Look, we have spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of years having conversations with a range of service providers and agencies around the way communications are being used within their delivery. So we obviously work within the communities, but we also talk to all those agencies and see how this information can help to understand what the barriers or the challenges are, and obstacles in using online or digital applications, so that we can be addressing those challenges as we go, rather than just providing the data. We want to actually help to inform some of those solutions. So yes, we've worked closely with NIAA. We particularly contributed to the discussions around the development of the First Nation Digital Inclusion Plan that was launched earlier, a few months back. We have talked to Department of Social Services, to a lot of health service providers, and we're part of other working groups to really look at how different ways that services are being delivered nationally can work on the ground in remote communities. We absolutely want to partner with everyone to address these issues, but the next phase of this project is really, you know, putting out this report, working with all of the communities, and generally through the First Nation Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. I know Lyndon and Dot and the team have had many of these conversations through that working group. So that's really probably the best forum to take it to the next level and actually come up with policy solutions with direct government engagement in that process.
Thanks, Daniel. Now a question from Janelle for Lyndon. Can you expand on Indigenous data sovereignty and what exercising that could mean for local communities?
Good question. Well, Indigenous data sovereignty means to me is about being partners, as Aboriginal people, being partners in the research. And that means that we have a say in developing the research questions, And also, once the research is being conducted, that we have access to the full set of results, and that we work in partnership with the research organisations, which is what we have done in this particular case. But also, as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that we started out on this project before I came onto the project was Julian had established an Indigenous reference group to move the project forward, and with Telstra. So right from the get-go, Indigenous data sovereignty means engaging Aboriginal people right at the start of the research project, and working on issues such as the design, even though we have the national data set and the questions were pretty fixed at the time. As part of our survey, we added questions to the survey, and in particular around how people access news and information, the way they access television, radio services. And so we added and tweaked the survey and added extra questions that were relevant to local Aboriginal communities. And so, of course, I gave a shout out. I saw Romain on the call, and Scott Winch and others that were involved in that very early stage of setting up the research and the research surveys. And we also, part of that was developing the qualitative research questions. So we're not only going out and delivering a survey, we're going out and actually asking people what's going on locally in the community. So those interviews help inform and interpret the research results that we got. And so, yeah, so in this instance, you know, I guess you could call it Indigenous data sovereignty in a certain way, but I also look at it as, look at it more in terms of digital, you know, supporting digital inclusion, and being able to work with communities to ensure that they have a say in the way that the research project progresses, and we're learning from them through the interview process and the communications with them.
Thanks, Lyndon. Another question that's come through is expensive prepaid plans appear to be a big barrier to digital inclusion. So in order to close the gap, should free services be offered via mobile networks or Wi-Fi or other networks? Lauren and Daniel, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So, yes, it'd be wonderful for people who are on low incomes to have access to technology, you know, at an affordable price, or, you know, for free. At the moment, where Telstra is doing some analysis on the use of how people are using their prepaid data, and looking at how often people are recharging, so that we can look at a plan that does suit low-income customers. So that research is happening now with, oh, sorry, not the research, the trial is happening right now. It's been going for a month. We'll let it go for another couple of months to see what their usage patterns look like, and then we'll be looking to see how we address an affordable plan.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Is there anything you'd like to add, Daniel, to that?
Yeah, sure. You know, one of the challenges here is particularly the importance of having access to essential online services, government services, banking and other, and we believe that there should be a level of free access to those types of services. We know that the Centrelink offices provide free Wi-Fi and computers in the offices, and many communities have provided some place where people can get some free Wi-Fi. But there is definitely a demand for people to be able to access those types of services within their house, rather than having to go into a public space to be able to access that. So it's always a challenge. The government programs to roll out mobile into remote communities rely on co-investment by the telcos, and so they need to demonstrate that they can get a return on their investment over a period of 7 years. And so there is an incentive, I guess, that the telcos have to make money on this, unless there is a fully funded program to ensure that these services are available to everyone. And I think we do need to revisit this now as we've reached the sort of market failure end of those programs, to look at more of a safety net, a next generation universal service model, to ensure that people can access the services that they need when they need and where they live.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Now, Julian, how will you ensure the sample design for future survey represents First Nations communities adequately? Is there a set and consistent set of survey design principles over and above negotiations with communities and opt-ins?
Yeah, well, yes, there is, Dot. So, I mean, I think it's really important that we do a few things looking ahead in terms of designing the next phase of research for this. Yes, we need to continue working with specific communities and listening to people in those communities. So the combination of collecting the data about what people are paying, what kinds of devices they're using, what they use the internet for, and what they want to use the internet for, all of that's very important at a data level. And we need to look very closely at which communities we're working with in order to get a strong representative picture of the state of digital inclusion across remote and very remote Australia. That needs to continue. But I think that we're also well aware of the fact that we are only looking at 10, 11, maybe next year 12 communities, and that there is a larger picture out there which we may not be capturing completely. So, I mean, we would certainly, we think that in order to get a finer grained, higher resolution picture of the distribution of digital inclusion across First Nations communities, especially looking at those regional, outer regional, and indeed urban communities in more detail, there is a strong case to be made for an expanded data collection, which would capture those places in more detail.
Okay, thanks, Julian. So, Lyndon and Daniel, you know, in terms of your visits to communities, someone's inquiring as to how people in these communities learn to use digital services. For instance, where there's access, does something like telehealth work, and who shows people how to use it?
Okay, thanks, Dot. I'll jump in here. We find that most of it is face-to-face in community learning, due to a lot of access issues in the first place. It's mainly younger people teaching older people how to use mobile phones and accessing services. We did see that there is actually a need for digital mentors in communities, so for people to come out and do some one-on-one training with individuals in particular communities, but we find that it's mainly face-to-face. People don't necessarily jump on and online to try and learn something. They will go to their peers, or there may be organisations within the community where people feel comfortable to go in and get some assistance and help. But often that help may be in a women's centre, it might be in the Centrelink office. So it really depended on the size of the community and the services available. And people were actually showing people how to use, jump on the computer, whether it was to jump on MyGov or using other services. So it was that peer-to-peer learning. But we also saw that a lot of people really wanted to have some sort of digital mentorship program in communities, and Lauren might talk a little bit to this, as I know Telstra has done some of this. I know NBN has gone out and done some training in communities as well as other service providers. So, but it's that localized peer-to-peer learning that people really respond to, and in particular in some of the communities that we were working in, where English is a second or third language and the Indigenous language is the most dominant language. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Lyndon. So Lauren, following on from that question and answer, have tech companies been identified as possible strategic partners for supporting local work through training and mentoring?
Thanks, Dot. Yeah, so we're working with the peak body First Nations Media Australia to identify local organisations that can provide the digital mentor training that Lyndon just talked about, because as the report shows, you know, people respond to the learning when they need it. So just in time learning, you know, before they get scammed and the bank account emptied. So it's important that we have local people in community, as Lyndon said, you know, people talking in language, helping people to stay safe online and to use their devices, you know, particularly as we enter a more digital online world. You know, I mean, we know that, you know, people still can't do two-step authentication. They don't have MyGov accounts. It's pretty basic, you know, tools that people need to stay online, but they don't have them. So if we had digital mentors in community that could help people, then that would be, you know, make an enormous difference. Yeah, but working with FNMA as the peak body, you know, I guess we'll work with them and their members to identify who are the you know, the local based organisations that need to be involved.
Okay. Daniel and Lyndon, have limited and specific free Wi-Fi locations impacted community safety in any way in the community survey?
I'll speak to that briefly. Maybe Lyndon, you can pitch in, but one of the challenges is when there is Wi-Fi in the centre of a town or community, it can become a congregation point. Some communities have identified that can be an issue, particularly at night, if young people are sort of away from their homes or gathering in a particular place in town. So that's been identified by communities, particularly Tennant Creek are trying to set up Wi-Fi within what's called the community living areas around the town to make sure that the young people have access to Wi-Fi close to home to address that issue. Beyond that, I think, you know, Wi-Fi in itself can provide actually a means of access where there is no other means. So Wi-Fi calling, for instance, has become a big part of communication, and people can use their phone to you know, make phone calls. So GAN, there's still high use of the Wi-Fi for as a primary means of phone calls as well as internet use. But it's only on between 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. as the community have chosen, so that the kids are at home and they're getting involved in cultural activities outside of those hours, and particularly during school time, that they're not coming in and engaging with internet when they want the kids to be at school. So I think there's a mixed response to that, and we do drill down on that within the report, some of those different experiences. Obviously, community can do content filtering with Wi-Fi, which is an advantage over the mobile services. And so that's one of the things that communities are very keen, is that they can particularly filter unwanted sites and reduce the access where, you know, for young people particularly.
Okay. Now, look, I've got one final question, and it is for Lyndon, which would most probably feed into the answer of that last question. So, Lyndon, can you outline how the local digital inclusion plans are being developed and how they can support local decision making and capacity building?
Well, I would because we've got 1 minute left, I'll refer people to our latest report, and you will see an outline in there for each of the 10 communities, which is sort of an outline of a digital inclusion plan and some of the things that the community fed back to us and how they can go about that. So and also in the back of each large community outcomes report for each community, you can see right at the back, there's an outline of a digital inclusion plan. So yeah, so I'd refer back to our reports on that one. But also that, I guess, digital inclusion plans and you can have a look at them as a good template. And I think it's something that all communities can progress and develop. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Lyndon. So thanks everyone for attending the launch of the Mapping the Digital Gap Outcomes Report 2023. Also, a special thanks to our speakers today. Now, one problem with having a launch virtually, right, is that we don't get to mingle over morning tea or lunch, you know, depending on where you're located, of course. It'd be my morning tea. But really, in all seriousness, whether we're meeting in one room together or virtually, it is vital that we stay connected, work collaboratively with each other, and have strong engagement with our First Nations communities to find place-based solutions to closing the digital gap by 2023. So I ask that we all do that and start sharing solutions with each other would be great. So thank you everyone for joining us. And that concludes the presentation.